All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome to our Sunday Forum. This morning, we are fortunate to have Kate Good sharing from the Parish Resource Center. But before we do that, we have a couple of announcements, as well as kind of in the theme of what we're talking about this morning and some of the important work that this congregation is doing. We wanted to share a letter from an individual that this congregation is doing.
The immigration support group has been working with several different families in Elizabethtown, and one of the families sent our committee a letter, and she wanted it read to the congregation. So that's why I'm here. It's anonymous. I know it is, but we don't want to give that. She says, I hope the whole community is doing well. I want to thank you infinitely for the help you gave me in the difficult times I lived with my children. You are the incentive I had. You're the unconditional company that you showed me, that you gave me. For all these attitudes that I received, I want to ask you for the favor that the help I have had can be given to another person or family that is going through a situation like the one I experienced. I make this decision because, thank God, I have a job where I'm being paid well and I have economic stability. I reiterate my thanks for your help. God bless you. I thought that was very important that she recognized that we have been helping her immensely. And now she wishes that the money we've been using goes to another family or another individual who may need that assistance. So this is an immigrant family, not a refugee family. Totally different situation. She does not have the resources that a refugee family receives when they come here to the United States. So I will.
Can you just say what her job is?
Oh, yes. Her job, which she loves dearly, is she goes at 3 or 4 in the morning, as I understand, doesn't get home until after her 3 children who are in the school district. She goes to a farm in Mannheim and milks cows. She recently had been attacked, I'll say attacked, by a cow. She'd been kicked, ended up in the hospital. Thankfully, no broken bones. Amazing from what she looked like, and showed me pictures. She's now back at work, and the employer there has been helping her tremendously, loves her, but it leaves the children at home alone to go to school, and when they come home from school, she hopefully is home when they get there. I don't know how many people would go to work and do that and love it, unless you're a farmer and love that kind of work. But she's an immigrant, she doesn't have working papers. This is the kind of job a lot of these families, mothers and fathers do, that if we didn't have them here, you wouldn't have your milk. So Deb has a very, very brief announcement also.
Morning, I know this announcement has been on the slide, so it's probably been out in front of you before, but we had 2 refugee families that we also helped here in our congregation. And on October the 20th, during the Sunday school hour, the faith formation hour, our Venezuelan family is putting together a PowerPoint presentation about their journey, how they got from Venezuela to here. It's a pretty long story, so I'm sure you'll want to hear it. Also, November 3rd and 10th, Sandy Brubaker and Paul and Sandy Brubaker will be sharing with our Haitian family more about Haiti and that family. So those are 2 opportunities coming up, October 20th and November 3rd and 10th. It is during the faith formation hour, so we have another opportunity.
All right, okay, good, welcome, thank you. We have a presentation to go along with what you're doing, so this will be shared for the room and for those of you who are watching, joining us online. So thank you very much.
you all so much for the opportunity to be here, and thank you for the wonderful work that you all do in the community. And have had the opportunity to speak with some of you over the years about different work that you're doing and that we're doing, and it's just a privilege to be here today. Pardon me. You may be familiar with the Parish Resource Center. We've been partners with Elizabethtown for Berlin for many years, but you may have thought of us as a library or a place that you can come pick up your vacation Bible school materials or your Sunday school materials, or maybe you come to a workshop or training. But recently, starting just before COVID, we've gotten really invested in working in immigration based on requests from churches that we work with. We work across denominations with about 85 different churches regularly, over 100 on a pretty regular basis. And we provide bookkeeping services and other support for congregations. And one day, a committee of folks from different congregations and attorneys in the community came to us and asked if we would consider being a fiscal sponsor for the work they were doing. And when I said yes, I had no idea what journey that would take us on, but we have really shifted from being, sort of the library of resources to being hopefully a way of connecting congregations to direct needs in the community as well. So in 2019, we got involved with the immigration and advocacy bond effort. As some of you probably know, York Detention Center was connected to the York County Jail. And so there was a large ICE detention center there, as well as a detention court. And during the previous administration, folks were coming to the border asking for asylum and then being held at different detention centers across the country. Oftentimes, the person was not related to the community where they were being held. They were far away from their family members, and they were being held and could be released on what's called an immigration bond. So without getting into the weeds, because everything in immigration is very complicated and changes all the time. So I will try and give you sort of the top level view. Many of you are probably familiar with some of this, and then I'm happy to answer specific questions, knowing of course that things may change next week. So bonds in immigration are federal bonds. They're highly unusual and they can run about $10,000 per person who's detained. They're not the same as somebody who's being held on a criminal bail system. So releasing somebody on an immigration bond means that they get to move out of the detention system and into the immigration system. And so they have a much better shot of putting together a case for their immigration plea that they're doing. So without getting into it too much, we got very involved in the bond process of immigration. We were able to raise $100,000 and bond out about 20 people who were being held in detention. That started in July 2019. And as we all know, in March 2020, the whole world changed. And so we got very involved working with immigration attorneys and ICE to help folks coming out of the detention system, which was one of the most COVID-heavy areas in our community. Jails, detention centers were very heavily impacted by COVID and quarantining folks before they got on buses or airplanes to go to their sponsors. We also provided bus tickets and travel kits. We helped folks stay overnight in motels before they got on the bus and headed to meet their sponsor, folks who would be caring for them and housing them while they were going through their immigration court process. And then we did also work with ICE and several attorneys to place people who would have otherwise been homeless in long-term resettlement spaces. So we had a number of folks who went to North Carolina and who also stayed in New York because they didn't have any other place to go. One of the things that came out of this is that we learned it's really critical for persons to have access to legal status whenever possible in order to improve their access to safe and affordable housing, to medical care, to food, to the basic needs that most of us take for granted. So I hope that this is not insulting, but because these things change so often, I'm just going to review a couple of immigration terms. So as we talk about what PRC is doing, we're all on the same page. So we hear a lot in this community about refugees. Asylee is also a common word. So just to sort of define both so that we're talking about the same group of people. Refugees, for which Lancaster County is very well known for welcoming our folks who are identified by the UN as a people group that needs resettlement in other countries. So the UN sets the agenda for who is going to be a refugee. They apply for refugee status outside of the US. It's often a 2 or 3 year process, as you may know, where they are interviewed repeatedly by State Department officials. There's an extensive background check. And then they are brought to the US, and upon arriving in the US have substantial rights that are available to them immediately. Work permits, a path to citizenship, a green card path. So refugees who come into the US have a great deal of need. A lot of times it's, understanding the culture that they have suddenly landed in, but they do have access to a lot of the resources and social services that a US citizen would have access to. If you apply for asylum, you do so upon arrival in the US. So you have a year-long window in which you can apply for asylum, and then you are on a path that can take many years to seek asylum. Your status when you arrive is undecided. Unlike a refugee, you do not know if you will become a part of the asylum system, or you will eventually have your case heard and it will be determined that you are not eligible for asylum. And you must prove not that your people group or your religious group has a specific threat against it, but you must prove that you as an individual have a specific threat against you that makes it hard for you to return to your country of origin. If you think about that, you have probably traveled to the US in a very convoluted way, often walking from Central America, even if you come from West Africa. You fly in, a lot of folks fly into Central America and then walk north. So imagine you've been carrying everything you own, you arrive, and then you have to prove that you personally have a specific threat from the country that you came from. You don't have a lot of paperwork with you, you don't have a lot of resources. It's a challenge, it's a very challenging prospect. And everything that folks who are seeking asylum, all of the court systems that they are a part of are run by the Department of Homeland Security. So one of the reasons that we like to differentiate between refugees and immigrants is because there's a vast difference in the number of people involved. So you can see on the slide, last year, we admitted as a country 6,014 refugees. The immigrants who are eligible for temporary protective status, which we'll get a little bit into in a moment, are 670,000. The immigrants who are undocumented but eligible for status is 1.1 million, and 10.5 million have temporary or no status. So when you think about, the efforts that we make for refugees, which is incredibly important, we are just taking a tiny slice of the pie of immigration. So just a reminder, we hear the word green card a lot. This is a common route for what is called family preference immigration. So that means that you have a family member who is a US citizen. Wait times for processing your green card application can be wildly different. As I point out here, folks from Mexico who filed in 1999 or 2001 are currently being processed for green card applications. So nothing about this system is quick. Temporary protective status, this is something that has come up a lot in the news recently. The Haitians in Ohio have been discussed. This is one of those statuses in the US that actually makes a lot of sense when it comes to immigration. And the idea is that people who are coming from a very challenging situation that maybe don't fit into the UN's idea of refugee have easy access to a short-term status in the US that gives them a work permit and makes sure that they have legal status, but it's a precarious status in that it is temporary. So if you're Haitian, you have to arrive by a certain point, and you have to know that your status is temporary. For Haitians, it has been a very long process. I think 1993 is when TPS started for Haitians. Haiti as a country just has not found good footing, but there is no long-term expectation of citizenship or green card. Many of you may be familiar with the idea of visas. Visas are something that I have gotten to go into other countries occasionally. We also talk about them in the US, student visas, tourist visas. They are a way of entering the US in a legal way, but for a short-term stay. And many of the folks that are considered undocumented or don't have legal status in the US have overstayed their visa. It's much more common for somebody to have overstayed their visa than to come across the southern border. And then immigration court, a reminder that immigration is a civil process. It is not a criminal process. So it is not run by the Department of Justice. Therefore, you are not entitled to an attorney. So one of the things I think that's always really important to remember is many people are entering the immigration system who do not speak English, who do not know our court system, and they have no right to legal representation. If you do have access to a private attorney, it can cost easily $10,000 to have a case with them. And then finally, because we spend a lot of time thinking, at least being told that immigrants are criminals or the worst of the society, it's just important to remember that moral turpitude is a major piece of immigration law. And what moral turpitude requires is that you have a very high ethical and moral standard in the way that you've lived your life, not just in the US, but also in your country of origin. So it's extremely vague. And I think that would just be something I would emphasize about everything about immigration in the US. It's very discretionary. It is not definitive. And so moral turpitude is really up to the immigration judge to determine. And a lot of times people will have an issue with moral turpitude because they were arrested or pulled over for something and never convicted of whatever reason that they were pulled over or arrested. So just having something, an arrest on your record can be enough to have you deported. We saw, especially during the last administration, that ICE was going through green card applications and actually going after green card holders based on divorce proceedings and other areas where we've never seen that before. So somebody was a green card holder, they'd gone through the entire process, and they were in jeopardy of being deported because of something in a divorce filing that accused them of something without any actual proof. Okay, so that's a lot of information quickly, but I wanted to make sure that we're a community that's really aware of refugees, that we were talking about the breadth of immigration. So we talked about what PRC is doing. Any questions from this? And then I'll get into what we're working at. Sure.
So if you come to the border and request asylum and you come into the country, that's not a crime.
That is correct. That is in fact following the way the legal system is set up.
So they are here legally if you come and apply for asylum.
That is correct. And you have, as I mentioned, a year to get through the application process. During that time, do you have paperwork that proves that you are here legally, that you were let in at a port of entry? After you filed your paperwork, you have opportunity for work and other, like availing yourself of the current social service system. So yes, all of that is legal. There's a legal pathway. We have been working with folks who we bonded out of detention in 2020, and they're just now having their second court case, or court hearing. So it's a very extended process, but all of it is within the legal system. Yes. Yes.
I don't care that, I mean, I do care what Trump says, but he claims that 20 million immigrants came across the border, which I would welcome 20 million. So what, it's closer to 10 million, isn't it?
Well, and 10 million folks without legal status takes into account folks who came here, you know, as children under DACA and do not have legal status. So it's not, this is many years of people coming into the US and not having legal status established. So there's a lot of statistics that are being used to frighten people. I think the important thing to say is that during COVID, there was very limited access to crossing the border. The Trump administration, folks who came and said that they were seeking asylum legally were being detained. So there has not been the influx of people to the degree that we've been told.
When the fearmonger also speaks of a mass deportation, you know, the legal system, that certainly is impossible.
Right.
So what could be possible?
Well, I think logistically, it's also not possible if you think about how we talked, so deportation law is a very specific area of law that a lot of folks don't work in. We happen to have worked in that most specifically. What we see is how challenging it is just to have, you know, a plane of people being deported, because a lot of countries where folks are being deported back to don't necessarily have the infrastructure to accept people well. I can't speak to what is, I think we've seen different approaches from the Supreme Court than I think a lot of legal scholars expected, so I can't speak to what the Supreme Court would determine. But I think, you know, if you start going after what Trump has suggested as people who are US citizens but have arrived within their lifetime, I think the chaos that would ensue would be something that we can't imagine. Just because where do you draw the lines? How do you decide who, you know, my family's been here since 1710, but we are immigrants, you know, so where do we start drawing that line? I think Trump's family came 2 generations ago, so where does his eligibility to stay land? Other questions? All right. So you saw this slide already, but I just wanted to remind you that most of the services that exist in Lancaster, excuse me, I had a cold and now I just have a cough left. So I'm not contagious, but if I turn away to cough, it's the residue of having a cold.
Take a little water.
Thank you. We're seeing CWS bring about 250 to 300 people into our community each year. That is fortunately a huge number of refugees in comparison to other communities. It's been a great benefit to our community. We can see the wonderful businesses and resources that we have developed out of that. But as I mentioned, refugees in general come with a lot of the rights of a green card holder or a US citizen. And so they have a lot of need immediately, but the long-term legal needs are less. And so our interest is not to recreate something that already exists, but talking to many immigration attorneys, social workers, we're seeing many folks in our community who do not have access to basic rights and can't meet basic needs because they don't have legal status. And so our interest is in helping folks be able to be here, knowing what their legal status is, and knowing, of course, that if you just look at this graph, many people don't have eligibility for legal status in the US who are here. And I think one of the things that we think is really important is to let folks know that fact as well. Because you can make really good decisions when you know what's possible for your family, for your job, for your healthcare. And so we really want to just work within the system that exists because we're just a small nonprofit and we know that we can do much more for the folks who have immediate needs than trying to advocate for massive systemic change. And so we're really focused on folks who are eligible for temporary protective status, folks who are here seeking asylum but don't have their paperwork completed, helping folks track their dates. As I mentioned, you know, many of these folks are involved in the legal system that's going to go on for 5 to 10 to 20 years. And if you're part of, you know, you're recently arrived and you're part of the transitory family group, how do you make sure that you show up for your court cases? We had a client who unfortunately passed away and his attorney did not let the immigration system know, oh, thank you so much. Thank you. And so he had a deportation notice on his record because he had passed away, but his attorney hadn't informed the court system. So just making sure that families aren't being harassed, that folks really know where they stand in the system. One of the major areas that we work in is with healthcare professionals and social workers, providing food resources for folks who otherwise don't have access to food. And what we just hear again and again is that people aren't able to access food pantries because they don't have paperwork. USDA does not require paperwork, but many food pantries do. They are not getting good medical care because they don't have access to medical assistance. They don't have access to safe and stable housing where they're not vulnerable to a landlord who can abuse them because they don't have legal status, and they're not able to seek employment. Many of the services that I've mentioned are available to refugees, and we want to make sure that we're providing support for immigrants in our community as well. And one of the things just to say is, if you file your paperwork, it costs thousands of dollars. Everything costs. So we help folks. You need to go through an extensive medical appointment to make sure your vaccines are up to date, or as you're applying for status in the legal system. Those appointments cost $200 or $300. Everything just costs a huge amount of money. So I think I get weekly inquiries from folks who are just not sure how to help somebody who's sitting in front of them that doesn't have determined legal status. And we get those requests from Union Community Care, which is a federally qualified healthcare system in Lancaster and Lebanon counties, the city of Lancaster, Penn Medicine, Food Hub in Lancaster City, tenfold, because they have folks who are trying to apply for an apartment but they can't run a credit check on that person because they don't have a social security number. Churchwood Service calls us all the time because they're so overwhelmed and they're looking for support. And then we get a lot of inquiries from church communities who have somebody in their community who doesn't have determined legal status and they're not sure how to help them. And again, as I said, just having legal documentation makes an enormous difference in somebody's life. We had a social worker tell us the other day that she had a client or a patient come in and she was complaining about immigrants in the community and how they're taking, all the healthcare. And she pointed out that many immigrants in our community pay taxes. They have an I-10 and a tax ID number. Maybe they don't have a social security number, but they have a tax ID number so they can open a bank account and have medical assistance. And so they need to pay taxes, but they receive almost none of the benefits they're paying taxes on. I had a call from a juvenile probation officer who her client had been released from prison, and he is a U.S. citizen, but his mother is not. And as part of probation, she was learning that his mother had no access to food. And she called me because her concern was, as a part of the court system, could she help this woman without jeopardizing her own job? And neither she nor her boss were clear about where the boundaries were for somebody assisting somebody who doesn't have legal status. So we're often dealing with large entities, at the city and county level, where folks are doing their very best. They want to be helpful, but immigration law is so confusing that they don't know where the boundaries are of what they can do and can't do.
Could they help? Could you help?
Yes. Yeah. So assisting somebody to find food who's not legally documented is not against the law. So I think one of the things that we just always want to emphasize is that these are the most vulnerable in our community, and helping them have support and access to legal support is critical for them diminishing their vulnerability. So occasionally the federal government does something really right. And one of the things that they did was establish a system where they recognize that there aren't enough lawyers to provide the legal care that is needed for immigrants. And that immigration law is a very paperwork heavy part of the law. And so they established a system where volunteers can go through a extensive training process and become the equivalent of attorneys in the immigration system. If they then join a recognized organization by the Department of Justice to provide free or low-cost legal services. And so that's what we're working to do. We've been asked repeatedly by immigration attorneys to do this because they just say, I can only deal with the most complicated cases, but I'm getting paid by people who really can't afford it to do their basic paperwork. And also, one of the biggest sort of heartbreaking pieces of immigration law is that there's an enormous amount of fraud in it. So you have folks who are paying thousands of dollars to somebody who's basically taking their money and doing nothing on their behalf. So I've gone through 2 rounds of this immigration training. First, with a small nonprofit, led the first training. It was led by lawyers, and then Villanova University. Since COVID, it used to be you could only do this in person, and that was pretty difficult because there were just not a lot of trainings available. But since COVID, it's become something you can also do virtually, and Villanova has a really good program focused on this, and it's run out of their department, their legal department, where they train lawyers as well. And so we have trained a number of volunteers to do this. We have attorneys that are part of this group, and we're working now to become recognized as an organization so that we can provide low cost or free legal services. The point, as I mentioned, is to really decrease the backlog of cases that are being held by attorneys so that they can focus on the most complex cases and provide the best support. We're really focused on routine immigration needs. That's temporary protective status applications, ITINs or individual tax ID numbers, green card applications and renewals, work permit applications. So we're putting together volunteers who will be trained to fill out each of these applications. We know statistically that when a person has support by a native English speaker who has been trained to fill out an application, they have a much better chance of getting approval on that application simply because, well, the U.S. government likes to create very complicated application forms. And the goal simply is to help somebody have residence, wellness, and economic independence. We know that economic independence makes a big difference in our community too, as we are always in need of low wage and low sort of education workers. So we had initial support from the United Way and the Lancaster Law Foundation. And so we were able to train 5 people through Villanova's VISTA recognition and accreditation program. It is not cheap. We don't want it to be cheap. You want this to be really good quality training, but it takes 12 weeks and costs several $1,000s. And now we're working to become a DOJ recognized organization. We anticipate that the paperwork will be completed in January. And hopefully our approval comes within 2 or 3 months of that application being submitted. So just to give you a brief overview of what the accreditation process looks like, we've really worked with our healthcare partners and CWS and other folks who are already working in this world to say what is it, where are the gaps in the system. And so we've structured our system to really fit that need. And then we're also working to set up good referring relationships with local attorneys so that they can take the cases that are really beyond what we as volunteers can provide. And we have outside support that we're working on developing with several different, they're large organizations that are able to accept referrals as well in case the Lancaster attorneys are overwhelmed. We really want this to be super accessible to folks. So we expect that we'll do a clinic once a week. That's very easy for people to get to by public transportation. And then we will also work at continuing ed for our volunteers so that the ever-changing immigration system continues to make sense to them. And then operationally, we will work at having folks come in and receive an initial consultation. And then lawyers and accredited representatives will work with them on filling out the paperwork. And folks have a wide variety of different areas that they can fit into in the immigration system. So making sure that they get slotted into the right trajectory so that they're getting the best possible shot at status. And then we will also do a lot of work in providing support in terms of childcare, food resources, other sort of case management pieces as well. So if you're still with me and have some interest in getting involved, I do have It looks at the back that we are happy to take your information. You can contact us directly. We're looking not just for folks who might be interested in getting trained to help support legal system, but also childcare, transportation, that sort of very low skill. You don't need to go through 12 weeks of training to do it. Support that would make a big difference in terms of making legal accessible to as many people as possible. That's the end. Sure.
I have a question about everything costs so much. And
Yes.
We know that our medical system is horribly expensive, as
Yes.
is our legal system. We do a lot of pro bono work to help people legally.
Yep.
Would there be a possibility of having pro bono medical things that take care of things like immunizations and all those other things that are horribly expensive?
I think that's an excellent question, and I think, we're seeing people get hung up on, one step that's just too expensive for them. One of the things that we work to do is create a fund that we can supplement the cost or cover the cost of things like people's medical appointments or legal appointments. I don't know that we can change the medical system to accept pro bono support, although I will say that Union provides their medical care on a sliding scale with the intention that they will never turn somebody away because of cost. And so I think, we can work at it in multiple ways, referring people correctly to the right resource. But civil surgeons, who are the people who provide the immigration appointments, are really few and far between. So also just encouraging people who are, still their licenses are current, but they're looking to retire or do something part-time, considering becoming a civil surgeon would make a big difference too.
I'm thinking of something as simple as immunization.
Yep. Yep, and I think that's where we have a lot of opportunity to get people into clinics where immunization is free. Yep. Yes.
Thank you for your presentation and for the work you're doing. It's really appreciated. But my question is, those that do go through the legal system applying for asylum, would you have a percentage as to how many actually are granted asylum?
30 to 40%.
And then those that don't get the asylum, what happens to them?
Normally they are looking at deportation notice. So I think asylum is often seen as sort of a good idea for folks who are coming in because it's such an extended process. So even if you ultimately can't stay, you have 5 to 10 years in the US, you have a work permit, you're here legally. But I think often we're not being fair to folks who are applying for asylum to give them really the statistical information of you have a very low chance of actually gaining asylum. And I have run into many clients who just say, well, I'm applying for asylum. And as you talk to them, you realize, unfortunately, their case is probably not going to withhold the pretty stringent criteria that the legal system has. And they have been told that they can get asylum. And so, the devastation to somebody who's lived here, who believes they've built a life here, and suddenly that's stripped away. And I think one of the things that we believe is important is to just be very honest with people about what their chances are, not to diminish them or to dissuade them, but I think to help them understand this is a very challenging system. Asylum is so discretionary. We work with a professor at Franklin and Marshall College who works at providing expert witnesses. She and her students are expert witnesses often in cases around African disputes, especially child soldiers. And she had to really work with judges to understand, like, if a child is not looking you in the eye during testimony, that is considered respectful in their culture. But the judges were thinking that this kid is shifty because they're not looking them in the eye. And so just even educating judges about trauma responses, how victims respond, how different cultures respond to authority makes a huge difference in whether somebody's asylum application is processed as credible. But how do you even begin to do that when somebody is in front of a judge for an hour and expert witnesses cost thousands and thousands of dollars? So I think it really, I was talking to my mom this morning and she's like, what would you say is the right answer for this very complicated process that is such a mess? And I said, I think just having things be very definitive would make a huge difference. People come believing something is possible that often isn't possible. So that is unkind and unfair, but we're also not giving people the best legal support that they deserve because we have such a runway of work that we have to do to help judges know, like, this is why this person is responding in the way that you think culturally is, shifty or doesn't seem honest, but in their culture is the definition of honesty. So I think it's just, there's so many pieces that need to be fixed. And I think if we could move it away from being discretionary, I think we would just provide so much more support and care for folks. Sure.
Our program started with a good news story of a dairy farmer who was a welcome person to a needy person for a job. So in Lancaster County General, how would you characterize the types of groups or organizations or companies or people that provide a welcome place for refugees?
I think we are an incredibly generous community in that way, in terms of, especially for refugees, we have a really good system for understanding that refugees have been through terrible turmoil. They came here legally. We understand and are very empathetic to their needs. I think we struggle more with immigrants who do not have a clear path, and we aren't sure, like, is this legal? Did this person do something wrong? Am I doing something wrong by supporting them? I get that question all the time, not just from people in the court system, but also, volunteers who want to help somebody. I think adjusting our framework of what immigration means and who is deserving of immigration and who isn't is really important to help support people who are vulnerable and maybe don't have as clear-cut cases of refugee. I think we do have to also be honest about our history, and I say this personally as well, that in the 70s, we were a community that took advantage of migratory migration into this community for poultry and chicken farms, and we did not care well for the people who worked for many farms and businesses in this community. So we have to work at overcoming that history too, of put people in bad housing. We didn't care for them well. We didn't think about their path to citizenship or how they were, able to return money to their families. So I think as a community with refugees, we're doing a great job. I think with immigrants, we have to keep working at how we understand immigration and really understand the benefit to us economically is pretty great when it comes to immigration. We have a lot of retirement communities, a lot of farms, a lot of economic drivers in our community that benefit tremendously from low wage labor that a lot of Americans don't want to provide. And so if you want economic growth, many economists argue that continuation of immigration is really critical to that. Sure.
I really would love to be able to have read the slides you had there.
Yes.
But my eyes would not allow that.
And it was a lot quickly.
Is it possible to get access to you?
Sure. I'm happy to send them to Jason, and if he can distribute to them, to you all, that would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, we do record these sessions here and it's posted
Good.
later in the week.
Good.
You mentioned deportation a couple of times. You mentioned a large plane that would have deportees on it. And so when we talk about immigration status and then they were deported, what does that look like? What, in general, I know there's thousands of stories, but what does that look like? Is it a plane that collects X number of people and when that's full, then that plane goes there, or?
That's typically how it's worked. It's expensive to deport people. One of the things that ICE got into a lot of trouble with the Trump administration was that they were flying people all around the country trying to keep them from their loved ones. And that's super expensive. Jet fuel is expensive. So I think to just say, like, to your question earlier about how do you deport 20 million people, I don't think we've even can fathom the cost of doing that. I think normally, as I understand it, and I haven't worked in detention law for a little bit, is that, they basically wait till a plane is full and then they send that plane to the country where that person has come from. They're not deporting people normally individually. Sometimes, and we didn't touch on this at all, there is a whole layer of folks who committed a crime, were convicted in the U.S., served time in state or federal prison, and then are deported. And sometimes that deportation is a little bit more specific because they don't want that person they don't want to pay to have that person held in detention, and they don't want that person to be back in society if they've been determined, to have a deportation notice. So it's a little bit different depending on the individual, but in general, it's a pretty slow process just because it's expensive.
Is there any kind of statistic or questions about when a person shows up at an airport in like Guatemala, that when they get off the plane, they're arrested?
I don't know what those statistics are. I don't have access to that off the top of my head, but I think a lot of people do fear for their own safety and are denied asylum and, return to a very unsafe situation. Coming to the US is not an easy process. And so it's not like, oh, I didn't find a job in my community, I guess I'll just go to the US and look for a job. It's a commitment of, months of time. It's incredibly physically arduous. We work with folks who have come with a coyote. I have a client who is a young woman who works 80 hours a week, trying to be able to pay back her coyote. And when she doesn't make her payments, her family in Mexico is threatened. So this is not, people are not naive most of the time. They're making a gamble and they weigh the risks and they are leaving everything that they love and care about to come to the US. So I think just to answer your question broadly, people are returning to something that's very uncomfortable at best. Sure.
Do you think there are any countries in the world who have this extremely complicated immigration problem figured out that could serve as a model for the US?
I don't think anyone does because I think we politicize so much of immigration. I've spent time in Scandinavian countries, which if you look statistically, they are what people say is the greatest place to live. They have the best systems and they're the most benevolent. And when I was there, right-wing politicians were using immigration as a driving force to pick up seats in the political body of that country. So we have always, as a country, demonized. I don't speak German as my first language because my ancestors, during the Second World War, believed that they were jeopardizing their safety to speak German in a public way. We have always demonized the other in our communities, and that's not just a US, statistic. That is a broadly, human statistic, I would say. I think, we can often be very critical of the US and the immigration system, and rightly so. But if you look at other countries, like in Europe, there's been a really challenging situation of having people integrated into society in a way that doesn't lead to really challenging racism, ghettoizing, immigrants. So while we have a long way to go, and I think a really complicated system to resolve in many ways, because we believe that immigration is critical to who we understand ourselves to be, but we haven't fixed it for a very long time. I think there really aren't any countries that we can say wow, they're doing this extremely well. Germany is probably a good example. The Germans accepted an enormous number of Syrian immigrants, but if you look at the fallout from that political decision, it was immense, and we've seen the rise of right-wing politicians in Germany in the last 10 years, in part because of that decision. So, yeah, I don't think there's an easy answer. Thank you. I think that's a really important question. Yes. In the back.
When are you talking?
A question for everybody. I just wanted, my cousin's in rehab and she can't walk or anything and she's really bad. And I just need everybody to pray that she would get better and walk again.
Thank you. That's important.
Yeah, just when are your classes starting again for those who are interested?
So the Villanova training, that's the 12-week training, will begin again, in the spring. I believe it's in, February. So if you do have interest in that, we'd love to hear from you. We are also just really interested in volunteers who we can train to do specific things without having to go through the accreditation process. So, if you want to volunteer, you're not signing up for 4 months of work or 3 months of work, necessarily. Thank you. Do you have a question?
Yes, I'm sorry to talk twice.
No.
People who have, individuals who have tax ID,
Yep.
are they eligible for Medicaid?
Not Medicaid. They're eligible for pieces of medical assistance. One thing I just point out is that in the state of Pennsylvania, many of our benefits are not at all available to folks who don't have a green card. And just also many of our benefits are extremely small. So, you know, somebody may eventually have access to welfare, but that's, you know, $600 to $800 a month. I would welcome trying to find a 1-bedroom apartment on that amount of money, let alone live. So, it's still very limited, but it at least allows for some level of benefit. And you can open a checking account. I mean, there are benefits of an I-10 for sure.
Is there a conduit at Parish Resource specifically for training group fund, a name?
A name for it?
Yeah,
We just call it our immigration legal services.
there's a fund for that.
There is, yes, yes. Yeah, we have tried our very best to keep this as low cost as possible because we do not want to charge folks anything for legal services. But with the staff time, the wraparound services, the training, we're looking at about $55,000 every year to run this program.
Yes, Venezuelan family that we have.
Yeah.
How long or when were they vetted? I'm going to use that term to come here.
Did they come as refugees?
Yes.
Help me out. I
Church
guess.
World Service.
Okay, they would have come as refugees then. Yeah, often, so I have friends who work for the State Department doing this and it can be 3 or 4 years. And there's no certainty for the family until they're on the plane.
I know they came through Peru and were there a number of years.
Yeah.
Here.
Yeah, and a lot of times we're seeing, like with Congolese in, that are coming into Lancaster in the last couple of years, they were in a, you know, refugee camp for almost the entirety of their lives, to speak languages that are not native to Congo, but they've just been in process for a very long time. Well, you all have been incredibly generous. Thank you so much. This is my favorite part of doing my job, is getting to talk to folks and getting your questions, because I learn a lot too. And just a huge thank you for all the work that you're doing in the community. I think so often folks come and, you know, with CWS, they get 90 days of support, and then they're really without long-term support in many ways. And so just walking with the families as you do makes a huge difference for them. And yeah, we just look forward to continuing to partner. So thank you so much.
And thanks for everybody, and thanks for your support for our immigration support. And we continue to get random donations to our conduit. And, so it's been very helpful, and we fortunately been able to help a lot of people, mainly in E-Town School District and Donegal. That's where we focus our money. So we don't send it to on the other side of the county. We try to get it focused. So thanks for your support.